Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all keeping well. In this video, I wanted to discuss the concept of clusters and share a simple process on how we can basically work them all out. Now, this is going to be really great for discovering new chord voicings, but it's also going to be fun to use within a single note line context or to decorate a melody when wanting to go for this very rich sound that clusters can provide. Quickly, just for anyone who's new to the channel, my name's Robbie, and this is where I try to share musical concepts that I enjoy, but I've also helped progress my playing as a guitarist and also as a musician. It's really a pleasure to share this stuff, so do consider subscribing to the channel if you want to keep up to date. So first things first, what are clusters? Put simply, it's basically when we have a collection of notes within a chord that are either a semitone apart or a tone apart. Chords are typically constructed by stacking thirds, and depending on the scale, both minor and major thirds are used through this diatonic harmonization. A minor third is the distance of 3 semitones, and a major third is the distance of 4 semitones. So if we have 2 or more notes next to each other which are less than that, so either a semitone or even a tone, which is the distance of 2 semitones, then we are making use of a cluster. As our more traditional 4-note chords are stacked in thirds to generate our chord tones, such as the root, third, fifth, and seventh, then this means that we'll be making use of diatonic extensions or scale tones found in between those chord tones in order to close the gaps and create these clusters. Now, for piano players, they can of course add several clusters, both tones and semitones within a single voicing. So, there's loads of different variations and options available to create different chord forms. However, on the guitar, we're somewhat limited to how many notes we can play within a chord, especially when playing clusters, because they typically require, fingerings with more of a hand stretch compared to the more traditional guitar voicings. Because of this, we're going to keep it simple today and only use one cluster at a time. That way we can focus on the concept of generating them on command for various harmonic situations, and this should hopefully leave you with a solid process to then explore and discover further so that you can creatively do as you please with this lovely sound. So let's get into it. Okay, so we'll look at both the semitone and tone cluster, but for this video, let's break it up and first look at using the semitone and make that our focus. We'll discuss a simple process which I'll share that's going to allow us to easily work out the cluster possibilities for any chord or harmonic tonality. But before we get into that, I think it's good to first take some time and look at what a 2-note cluster could imply or be a part of from the perspective of each root note. To do this, we can take 2 notes a semitone apart and lock them in place while we chromatically change the bass note. And then in turn, we can think about what scale tones the cluster could be, and therefore what harmony it could imply for each bass note acting as the root. So let's take a B and a C for our semitone cluster. I'm choosing these notes because it allows us to use an open string. Now, open strings aren't essential for playing clusters, however it can definitely give us more voicing options as well as avoid the need to constantly stretch our hand. Also, open strings just resonate and sound really good. Okay, let's start with using C as our root note, and then we'll ascend chromatically from there. So the intervals of our cluster notes in relation to C being the root give us the major 7 and a root. This means that this cluster can be used within a voicing or phrase for any scale that has a major 7th. The obvious example is just a basic C major 7. But this could also be used within a C Lydian sound. Now, it is important to also look at the other parent scales and their modes, as this cluster will of course work for any of the many scales that have a major 7th and, a root note. However, at this point, I don't want us to get too hung up on the vast amount of modal options this cluster could imply, but instead, I just want us to start to recognize what this cluster is in relation to that specific root note in terms of intervals. The process which I'll show later will give us a much quicker way to learn and apply this sound when confronted with a specific harmonic situation where, we desire this sound of a cluster for our voicing or phrase. However, but just as an example, let's quickly list out the many options for this root note just to show how we could find them, but then for the others, we'll keep it simple and just do a basic overview. For this, I'm going to think about my main parent scales, the major, melodic minor, harmonic minor, and the harmonic major. I've made cheat sheet PDFs for these parent scales as they're a really helpful resource for stuff like this, just because we can use them to clearly find all the modes within those parent scales that have this cluster within them. But also, and most importantly, I've written out how these modes can function within a chord progression. I'll talk more about that later on, as they'll also come in handy when we discuss the simpler and more direct process for generating clusters, which I'm going to share later in the video. So there's going to be lots of options for this one, as the cluster has the root note in it, and as we know, every scale has a root. So looking at modes within the previous parent scales which I just mentioned, we get other types of Ionian and Lydian sounds, such as Lydian augmented or Ionian augmented. We also get Lydian with a sharp 9, or also Lydian augmented sharp 9. So of course this cluster works for the parent scale harmonic major itself, as that has a major 7th in it as well. Let's also remember the various minor scales which have major 7ths too, such as melodic minor or harmonic minor, or even melodic minor sharp 4, a mode from harmonic major. We can also look at further sounds not within those parent scales, like the symmetrical whole half diminished or also the augmented scale. But again, let's just keep it simple for now, as later in the video when we talk about the process for, immediately generating the cluster options for whatever harmony we're confronted with, you'll see that we don't necessarily need to learn all of what we're currently doing in super detail. It's just a nice visual exercise to first start with as a way to demonstrate some voicing examples. So for the next root notes, we'll just keep it simple and cover the intervals and what they are and the general sound that they would work for. Okay, moving to the next root note, D flat, while the cluster notes stay locked in place. Well, for this one, we get a major 7th and a flat 7, so it doesn't really line up to any of the usable harmony which we'll be calling upon, and therefore doesn't really give us anything, so we can just skip this root note. For D in the bass, the cluster is now the 6th and the flat 7. So this is going to work great for our dominant chords that have a natural 13th, such as a dominant sus, or just a regular D13. Maybe something with more tension, like a D13 with a flat 9 or with a sharp 9. Again, without covering all the options, another common sound would be to use this cluster within a D-Dorian context. Next one, over E flat, we now get the sharp 5 and 6th. So my first thought would be like an E flat major 13 with a sharp 5 type sound. Okay, so now we can already start to spot something that's going to help us with the application of these cluster options. With a sound like E flat major 13 sharp 5, you could see it as implying the E flat Lydian augmented scale, which is the third mode of the C melodic minor parent scale. If we instead hear the voicing I just played, but with C in the bass, so, well, we clearly get a C minor major 7, just like we had earlier, as that was one of our options when C was our root note while still using the same 2-note cluster. This tells us that the cluster used for the parent scale will of course be found within each of its modes. It'll depend on what the intervals are in relation to each scale on whether it will work well or not, but for the case of the melodic minor modes, and especially this one, it's going to work great, as you can hear. Same goes for the D-Dorian voicing I played. This cluster was the same for C major, and D-Dorian is a mode which comes from the C major parent scale. We also said that we could use that cluster within a D13 or D-mixed Lydian sound, and that makes sense because this 2-note cluster is found within G major, and D-mixed Lydian is a mode from that G major parent scale. I just wanted us to start spotting that already, but we'll get deeper into using this as a part of the process, which I'll explain later in the video. Next, root note E, we get a 5th and a flat 6. This could be used for a sound which again comes from the C major parent scale, like E Phrygian. Could also be E minor 7 flat 6, or we could use it within a E harmonic major voicing, or even E Phrygian dominant. Over F we get the sharp 4th and 5th, so a great cluster for an F Lydian sound. For G flat we get the 4th and flat 5th. This actually works great when used for a half diminished chord. Okay, almost there. So having G as the root note, that gives us the third and the fourth, which can be a bit of a strange cluster to use as an Ionian sound, even though it's diatonic to that mode. However, it can be a really interesting one to use for a dominant voicing. So the last few root notes are pretty straightforward. Over A flat, we get the sharp 9 and major third, so this is going to be great for a dominant tension, either implying an A flat altered or half-old diminished flavor. You could also experiment a bit and make it work for an A flat augmented scale. Over an A root note, the clusters give us an A minor 9 sound. This is a really common one people use as an example when describing how a cluster sounds quite nasty out of context. However, when it's buried within a chord, it gives this really rich and beautiful quality to the voicing. Moving on to our B flat root. This doesn't really give us anything because the cluster notes bring out the flat second and the natural second. So just like the D flat, this doesn't really line up with functioning sounds from our conventional parent scales. And in fact, anytime you have three notes next to each other, like the major seventh root and flat second, or in this case, we've got the root, the flat second, and the natural second, well, this isn't really going to give us much because we just don't see consecutive semitones like this within the kind of diatonic scales which we're focusing on here. This is probably because it's hard to make three notes like this sound good or fit. For example, here's E flat, E, and F. So sounds pretty nasty. However, I was shown a voicing years ago which used these semitones, or these three notes, but it sounded pleasing because of how the notes were organized within a chord. Well, those three notes are in there, but suddenly it sounds awesome. It's because it's voiced amongst lots of fourths and fifths, and this creates a very stable sound. This tells us that really we can make anything work or sound pleasing if organized and voiced in the correct way. Anyway, back on topic, moving to our final bass note B. Well, we get the root and the flat second, so this is going to work brilliantly for several of our various dominant 5-chord tension options. Here's a nice dominant sus flat 9 sort of Phrygian sound. Okay, so now that we've identified what sound this cluster can provide for each root note, by doing this, we've also essentially been working out what harmony the cluster brings out when building it from each interval against a specific root. So if you really wanted to solidify your knowledge of this further, you could now flip it around and keep the bass or root note fixed in place while you look for which intervals you need to build the cluster on in order to generate the harmonic options we've just gone through. I've written all of this out within the detailed PDFs for this video, so that will give you a clear perspective on how to learn it. But just to give you an example of what I mean, here's the first three harmonic options which we had. We said that the cluster over C gives us a C major 7. The cluster over D would give us a D dominant 13th sound. And over E flat, it was a E flat major 13 sharp 5. So let's keep the bass the same and move the cluster around to generate those same chord types. Let's just pick a random note, so maybe let's use B flat as our fixed root. So we get B flat major 7, B flat 13, and then it was B flat major 13 sharp 5. So this is now really teaching us what interval we need to build the cluster from to imply a certain chord or harmonic option. Okay, so before moving on and discussing the better process which we can use to generate a cluster, I wanted to quickly say that we can and should also explore doing everything we've just done, but with the tone cluster, or in other words, using two notes a whole step away instead of just a semitone or half step. This can be a really nice sound to use as a type of cluster. However, because we tend to have more whole steps found within a scale than semitones, well, this gives us more cluster options for a single harmonic choice, and therefore it can be a little overwhelming to work out. But this is why I wanted to start with the process we've just done, as by picking one cluster option, in this case it'll be two notes a tone apart, and keeping those two notes fixed in place while changing the bass note, well, this is going to help us break down and identify the options one by one. So this process is actually extra useful for the tone cluster. For this video, I just wanted to focus on using the semitone as our cluster so that, we could keep this video condensed while still going into detail. That being said, everything we do for the semitone can also be applied to the tone cluster as well. And again, you'll find all of this written out within the PDF material for this video, where you'll be able to go deeper into this concept. Just quickly though, to give you an idea of this same process, if we take D and E as our whole step cluster, and then moving the bass, so starting with C. If this is our root note, then these intervals become the second and the major third. So this could imply our various Ionian modes. It will also kind of work nicely for our main Lydian options that have a natural second. This one's quite a nice voicing actually, because it has both a semitone and tone cluster in there. So does this one. This cluster can also work for our mixed Lydian variations. Again, not all of them, but you'll find each option written out in detail on the PDF. So I know this might just seem like a bunch of random listed out chords. However, the thing to remember is that they all have a harmonic function which we should know, meaning that different chord types coming from various scales or modes function a certain way when used within a chord progression, whether they're diatonic to the key or not. So that's not necessarily what we're getting into here. However, starting with what we've done to discover the clusters will help us learn what chord type we generate when having the cluster placed on a certain interval. It's a longer process, but it's a nice way to first discover this sound and its possibilities. With that said, let's now get into the quicker process, which will allow us to generate the cluster options on command for whatever harmonic scale we want. So doing this will require some general knowledge of chord scale relationships, and also knowing what parent scale a certain mode comes from will make this process even easier. As I've already mentioned, I've written up cheat sheets for the main parent scales and all their modes. This is going to be a really useful resource to have, because not only does it show all these modes in their correct spelling, but it also shows their function. This is one of the most important things to know when trying to understand how certain modes work in a harmonic context. So you can check out those PDFs out and use them as a reference if you want a greater understanding of this stuff. So let's first look at the modes from the major parent scale. Now here's the trick to knowing what clusters are available to use for a specific mode. Focusing on the semitone cluster, there are only two semitones found within the major scale and all of its modes, and therefore there are always going to be two different semitone clusters available for us to use. Now, knowing that there are only two semitones within a major scale is pretty obvious stuff. However, we can use that knowledge to help us a lot with this. For example, the two semitones are always found between the third and the fourth and the seventh and the root of the parent scale. So regardless of what mode you play, as long as you can identify what major parent scale that mode is coming from, you'll easily find the clusters, as it'll just be the third and fourth or the seventh and root of that parent scale. This will save us from needing to learn where the semitones or clusters are for each of the 7 individual modes. Now, don't get me wrong, over time you will naturally learn this, as by doing this enough you won't need to think about the parent scale to execute a cluster. However, this will only develop by discovering these sounds and practicing them and finding ways to creatively use clusters within your chord voicings or single note lines. So basically by just generating musical language for yourself. And therefore, this process is a great way to start because it will give you the answers. So let's do some examples. Starting with an easy one, let's first take D Dorian. So as we know, this is a minor scale and harmonized as a 4-note 7th chord, we get D minor 7. The parent scale for D Dorian is C major, and we know that one of the semitone clusters is between the 3rd and the 4th of that parent scale. So this would be the notes E and F. With this knowledge, we can now find a way to voice this cluster within our D minor chord. It's actually quite easy for this one because we can make use of the open E string. So we get this really beautiful D minor 9 voicing using this rich cluster sound. And we didn't have to use the open string, we could have done something like this. It can just be nice to use the open strings when possible. What about the other semitone cluster found on the 7th and the root of the parent scale? Well, this is the one we had at the beginning, B and C. So we know that this is going to give us a D minor 13 flavor. So all of these clusters are just bringing out, the colors of this D Dorian mode. There's probably actually a way we could voice a chord with both clusters actually. So we're just lucky with the key for this one. So as you can see, this is a much quicker process and it's easy to do for the semitone cluster. But as I mentioned earlier, there are more options for the tone cluster as there are more tones found within these parent scales. Hence why the first process might be a nicer way to start in order to discover sounds and voicings for that one. Let's try a different sound. Let's take a C altered scale to see what clusters we get. So firstly, C altered is the 7th mode of D flat melodic minor. And melodic minor again has 2 semitones, but this time it's between the 2nd and flat 3rd and then also between the 7th and root. So for D flat melodic minor and therefore also for C altered, those notes are D sharp and E and then also C and D flat. So that C and D flat cluster is giving us the flat 9 over C7. I've got the sharp 5 and 3rd in there too. So this is just a C7 sharp 5 flat 9 chord, or in other words, a C altered. Now for the other cluster, D sharp and E, well, this is the sharp 9 rubbing up against the major 3rd. So now this is a really cool C7 sharp 9 sound, and again, if you know your harmonic functions, well, this is a great one to use for a dominant 5 chord tension. So hopefully with this thought process, you can start having some fun with this cluster concept. Just start by taking sounds or some scales that you often use and go from there. See what you discover, as you might stumble on something that's worth adding to your chordal vocabulary. Give this a go using modes from the other parent scales too, such as harmonic minor and harmonic major. For harmonic minor, that has 3 semitones to play around with. Also, see if you can find some cool sounds using clusters a tone apart, using this same process. There's going to be lots of options, but there's definitely some great chordal voicings to be had. So finally, the last thing I wanted to share is a simple way to practice clusters in more of a scalic fashion. What we can do for this is take a cluster from any part of the scale, either a tone or a semitone, and then move it diatonically through it. So for example, here's C major. If we take this cluster as our starting point and then move it ascending through the scale, as you can hear, this is giving us all the available semitone and tone clusters from the scale as we move the starting shape up. Now, to make this sound a little more musical, it's nice to resolve the bottom note down to the next diatonic note below, just after you play the cluster. So something like this. This turns the 2 notes from being a cluster into a diatonic third, and this is just a really nice pianistic styled move. We can also practice this across several string sets too, rather than just up the fretboard on the same 2 strings. Now, it won't be perfectly in position, of course, because of the stretch that we need to do to produce the cluster, but what we could do to help with visualization is say that the melody note played by the index finger will be moving through the assigned position. For example, if we choose this position for C major, well, we could say that the melody note or index finger is bound by that position. We then just attach our diatonic cluster on the string below while we visualize our melody note going up that chosen position. So this may just help give you some guidance on when to change strings by using positions you already know. It's also nice to hear the resolution note as each point of the scale with just a harmonized third on top. But it can be harder to visualize this way to begin with. We should of course do this for other scales too. Here's C melodic minor in the same position. I've written these out for each parent scale assigned to all the positions which will cover the neck, so you can find that amongst the PDF material. And once you've practiced this a bit, a fun thing to do is voice lead this idea through chord changes. Again, I've written out a load of extra fun examples for this on the PDF too. So I hope you enjoyed this one and that it helps to inspire some new sounds that you can try out for your improvising or compositions. That's all from me. Thanks a lot for watching. Feel free to hit the like button as that really does help the channel out. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos. I've got some cool concepts which I'm really excited to share coming up. So, thanks so much for following and it really does mean a lot. If you're interested in the PDF material for this, as well as a bunch more musical things to study, you can find links for that in the description below. As well as the examples shown in the video, I've also done the transcription and analysis of the performance, which I did at the start. That was me just trying to overdo this cluster sound over the great song, All the Things You Are. I've written out a few more studies applied to other songs as well, so you can check that out too. Have fun practicing, and I'll see you soon.